a mesh network, these motion graphics tools inside of Maya, very, very powerful. And just to show you where the tools are, how they're set up, you can go in and create a torus. You want to be careful with how many sides you're creating or how dense your mesh is for your mesh network. Simpler the better. Start with cubes or some simple low poly thing before some massively smooth mesh. But anyway, we have this mesh panel, which has most of the tools you need. Kind of stuck in here is also a text tool, an SVG tool. A text tool you can use to just create any type in 3D, which is really cool, and it will automatically help you create bevels and stuff like that, so it just looks nice and sharp. And then the SVG tool helps you pull in 2D vectors to be able to extrude those into 3D objects. And those are in here because those are real common things to set up with a mesh network. Some basic model that would be used in motion graphics. But we're just going to use this. And as with any panels, a lot of the main panels and tools and things are on this panel. It might even be all of them with mesh. But I always like to keep an eye, especially when you're first learning, on the actual drop downs, which has all of the tools. So if we go under animation, mesh, that's funny, there's even less of them here. Oh, there we go. So there's the create mesh network and mesh editor. And then we've got a bunch of utilities. And we've got a bunch of dynamic stuff. In a general sense, we can just click on Create Mesh Network. I'll look at the options for a minute. I can see, okay, so there's some distribution options type, linear and a grid and a circle. Yeah, we're just gonna leave it default there. And I'm gonna go to Mesh, Create Mesh Network. And by default, I all of a sudden get this network of 10 objects. So it just created this array. Not very exciting yet, but you can see what is kind of exciting is I happen to have had the attribute editor open. If I had the channel box open, wouldn't make much sense. And I have this mesh 1 node now that represents my mesh network. And inside the attribute editor, there's all of these different tools and deformers and all of these different things that we can apply, these different nodes to apply to our mesh network. And what's really cool about them is each one has its own properties and varieties. So a distribute node is added automatically. And I can go over this distribute node and I can see number of points, distance. So I can play with this and I can just quickly slide from having 10 instances to having like 100 instances of this model. Just by deciding how many there are. I can play with the distance of them apart. I can play with their offset and their rotation on all these different angles. And it's really these properties that are affecting all of these different pieces at once. And remember, all of this stuff you can usually animate as well. So at any point, I can right click and I can set key. So there's a lot of power you can use to just automatically create these real complicated sets. So instead of linear, if I want to go to radial, now all of a sudden I've got these Fruit Loops flying through the air, and I could literally animate any of these different things in the distribution node. Maybe I want to go to spherical, which puts it actually in 3D instead. So just imagine the effects that you could use of just very quickly taking an object and using just the distribution node and animation speed, the radius of the sphere itself. You can make an explosion of Fruit Loops very, very quickly. So again, I'm just looking, and I'm only in the main part of the distribute node here. I can get into the strength of it, and you can create, anything in Maya. You can get really, really deep with different ramp values and multipliers and all kinds of things. But what's cool about this is that's just the one distribute node that's added kind of automatically. So anyway, outside of this initial distribute node there is a whole bunch of other nodes that do different things in here. Like I could add a random one to it, I can add a random node, and now all of a sudden in my mesh network, not only do I have the distribution node, but I also have this randomized node where now I have all of these other different fields that I can play with, that now all of a sudden I have a very, very random sea of Fruit Loops here. And if you could imagine animating these properties, how quickly you could set up just a massive amount. I mean, you could, for example, create a little low poly tree, and you could use this to very, very quickly populate a very, very complicated scene with versions of your tree that have different seeds and different scales and sizes. And there's a lot you can do with this. But what's really cool is no matter how many nodes that you add, you have this kind of, what do they call it? I guess it's just a mesh editor. You can kind of see it in here, but there's a mesh editor you can click on right here. Here's the actual create mesh node, and then the mesh editor. And what this does is this works like a non-linear editing system where you can turn it on and off. So I want to turn off my random and turn it off, and turn off my distribute and turn it off. And you can also, once you have a stack of these, you can change the order in which they appear in the stack. And that will affect how they're actually affecting the whole mesh network and whole mesh object and everything like that. So as you can see, just off the bat, you can use the distribute node that automatically created with the mesh network to duplicate and just populate in all kinds of crazy ways a mesh here. But what I'd like to do is, like I said, instead of spending, a lot more time than this person would take over 12 minutes to show you a lot of different features and how some of these nodes can kind of go together. This is actually from Autodesk. In fact, pay attention to this logo that comes up once I play it, because this entire logo and everything that it does is actually built with the mesh network. And you can actually go look up and you can find a video that's about an hour or 2 hours long or somewhere in the middle that shows you how to do everything this logo did, or at least what they did to use the mesh network. But there's a bunch of stuff out there you can search for. If you just look for Maya mesh, and there's a bunch of cool videos. People will start to combine it with paint effects and combine it with different things to create all kinds of wild, really powerfully, dynamically created effects.